Hey, Erin, just doing a sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I definitely can.
I'm going to admit Carla
Okay.
too. Oh, did you hear that, Emma? Like our conversation playing back?
No, are you getting audio feedback?
I think what it is the live stream was playing. So it's playing us talking like 15 seconds after we stop. But I just muted that.
Yes.
And so hopefully that's fine. I muted it like in YouTube.
Yeah, hopefully that should do the trick.
I'm not hearing it.
Mhm. Are you able to see my screen, my video, or is it just the PowerPoint slide?
I see your video in the side.
Okay, you do. All right.
Mhm.
Awesome.
And Carla is in as a guest, so she presumably can hear us, but she can't unmute herself.
Hey everyone, welcome. If you're just joining, we're going to start in a couple of minutes. Let folks have a chance to get into the Zoom. Okay, welcome everyone. I think a few folks are still working on arriving, but we'll get started now. It's about 12:03. Welcome to IRWA's State of the River. You're going to hear from Erin, Bonney, Casey in just a moment. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. First things first, if you would like, please share your name and a fond river memory or some fond time that you've had in nature in the chat. Erin is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to everyone to just share your thoughts after Erin's remarks. Everybody is muted right now, and you don't have the power to unmute yourself. So if you are hoping to share something at the end of our talk today, then you can either use the hand raising function or drop something in the chat, and I can unmute you or read your question aloud from the chat. This call is being recorded. There is a live stream that can be accessed on our YouTube channel, and it can be accessed after the fact as well. And this will also be recorded. Thanks, Erin. With that, oh, and I see some folks are already sharing their memories in the chat. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin, Bonney, Casey, Executive Director here at Ipswich River Watershed Association. All yours, Erin.
Thanks, Emma. And thank you all so much for coming today to hear a little bit about what is going on at the Watershed Association, given the headwinds we're facing with the drought, and how we're thinking about what the next 4 years looks like. It's a little bit weird for me to be on a Zoom where I can't see anyone else. So I'm just going to imagine that you're all thoroughly engaged and like nodding along to everything that I'm saying. But I really appreciate you taking the time during your lunch hour to log on today. So I want to start with just a mention of what is IRWA's mission and vision. Our mission is to protect and restore the Ipswich River and its watershed now and for future generations. And our vision for the future is that the Ipswich River and streams, ponds, and coastal waters of our region are healthy and beautiful. Clean waters flow year-round, native fish and wildlife thrive, and the river is resilient and adaptable to climate change. Natural areas keep the river clean and provide places for families and community members to enjoy nature. Our drinking water is clean, safe, and abundant. We work in committed partnership with communities, businesses, schools, and other organizations to educate the public to protect the river and the watershed forever. And I think probably most of you on this call are familiar enough with IRWA and with our mission and vision that none of that is a surprise to you. But I want to emphasize it because all of our work is guided by our mission and in pursuit of our vision for the future of our river and our watershed. And we will continue to be guided by that mission and vision, regardless of the challenges that we face. So I'm going to start with drought, which is probably the most immediate challenge that our watershed is facing. So you all saw, or most of you at least saw, the map that we had up on the screen at the start of this webinar. Earlier this week, actually just yesterday, the state's Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs updated the drought status, and right now, the entire state, minus Cape Cod, is in stage 3 critical drought. And for reference, Massachusetts defines drought levels from 0 to 4, with 4 being an emergency drought and the most severe scenario. So stage 3 is absolutely a concerning scenario to be in. We last entered stage 3 drought in July and August of 2022. As an example of how severe this drought is in our region, earlier this month, Massachusetts DEP issued a declaration of state of water supply emergency for the town of Ipswich, which will allow the town to tap into alternative water supplies. And that's just a reflection of how this drought is playing out on the ground and how serious the water supply situation is for the town of Ipswich. We're also seeing an unusually active fire season at this time, and I know that is not news to any of us that are currently on the North Shore. It's been smoky up here for weeks. Fighting fires requires a lot of water, so that's also a concern for the river. I've been saying this fall that the fires are kind of making my case for me as to why we absolutely need a resilient water supply that's going to be able to be available during times of critical or extreme drought. This drought is on par with some of the recent droughts of record that we've seen in 2016, 2020, and 2022. And during all of those droughts, and during this one that we're currently in, we saw flows in the river bottom out at 0, and sections of the river and its tributaries run completely dry. What's incredibly unusual about this drought is its seasonality. Typically, droughts in our region are most severe in August, and then by November, we're seeing recovery from drought conditions. This unusual occurrence of a drought that didn't start until September and is looking to extend into at least December just highlights how weather patterns are becoming more unpredictable. Typically, when we're in a drought scenario, you'll hear the Watershed Association talking about outdoor lawn watering a lot, because outdoor lawn watering uses about 1,000 gallons an hour and is the main water use during the growing season in our region and the biggest concern during a drought. This drought, we're not in the growing season. Hopefully no one is watering their lawns because the grass is not growing in November, but we're looking at high volumes of water used to fight brush fires. That difference is really striking. Drought is troubling in any season. The fact that this drought is taking place in the fall when juvenile migratory fish like river herring are looking for their path out to the ocean, aquatic animals are moving into hibernation, or at least they should be. And a dry river can be devastating for animals looking for their winter refuge. And it's also happening just before the season when water suppliers are typically drawing from the river to fill reservoirs. Our water supply regulations in the state of Massachusetts are not set up with an eye to the possibility of late fall drought that extends through the winter. And it really highlights the need for this system to evolve with the realities of climate change where weather patterns are shifting. So what are we doing about drought? Sometimes it feels like the obvious solution to a drought, which is rain, lots of rain, is out of our control. and that droughts are just one of those natural disasters that we have to weather. But compare droughts to other natural disasters like storms. We might not be able to avoid the storm, but we can be prepared for when, not if, but when it comes. And similarly, our work is focused on the resiliency of our watershed, aiming to ensure that our river and our watershed community is healthy enough to withstand these challenges. So what is IRWA doing specifically? We are educating people about the need to conserve water. And we are not just having those conversations during state declared droughts. We are talking about it year round with the thousands of kids that participate in our environmental education programs. We are talking about it in adult lecture series and in meetings with town staff and with state agencies. We are pushing for the state to codify their response to drought so that we will be prepared for the next one. We are helping people to install rain barrels and pushing for low flow toilets to be included in building codes, because the more water that we leave in ground, in ponds and in our river all the time, not only is that great for our ecosystem, it also means that we will have more water for when we really, really need it, like now, when we have brush fires in the middle of a drought. The best time to prepare for a drought is not when you're in the middle of a drought, it is in all of the time before the drought actually happens. And that is really the job, our job and the job of all watershed associations is to continue to push for these solutions, even when the drought fades from our collective consciousness, when it eventually starts raining. And I promise it will rain at some point, but I'm not promising anything on timeline. And with that, I'm going to shift, and I tried to come up with a good, pivot here, and I don't really have one, but I'm going to shift to talk about the implications of the new administration and how IRWA is looking at continuing our work going forward. So I just want to remind you all that we are a nonprofit, non-governmental organization, which means that we, the staff, the board of directors, and our incredible community of volunteers, members, and advocates get to decide the best course of action to further our mission and our vision for the future of our watershed. Sometimes IRWA allies with government agencies, and sometimes we challenge them to think about new ways of doing things and push back against policies that do not align with our vision. For example, the removal of the Ipswich Mills Dam is our highest priority restoration project. It is also a high priority for the state's Division of Ecological Restoration and the Federal National Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, all of whom share our vision for a restored herring run in the Ipswich River. And we have been working closely with those agencies on this project. On the flip side, IRWA has long argued that Massachusetts needs to be rethinking the ways in which we manage our water resources to be more protective of stream flow and ecological health. And as a result, we have been challenging the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection to update existing regulations with that vision for the future in mind. We will always look for allies in the state and federal government who share our vision for the future, and we will always push back against policies that we believe are detrimental to our river. And often we will do both of those things at the same time with the same administration. And that is our role, regardless of who is in power at the state or federal level. Some specific things that we're thinking about with the upcoming change of a federal administration. The new administration has indicated that it will focus on deregulation writ large and transfer of authority to the states. There may be low to no enforcement of important regulations under the Clean Water Act. From our perspective, enforcement of the mechanisms that protect our river is not optional, and organizations like ours will be working to hold the government accountable to protecting clean water, as we all expect it to. By way of example, back in 2017, the EPA recalled MS4 permits after they had been released, and this is going to get a little bit wonky for a second. MS4 permits require municipalities to implement important practices to minimize pollutants entering waterways from stormwater runoff. Stormwater is the #1 source of pollution in our river. It's also the #1 source of pollution in rivers nationwide. So by recalling these permits, the EPA essentially rolled back regulation aimed at minimizing harmful pollution from entering our waters. Under the leadership of the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance, watershed organizations like ours joined together and filed suit against the EPA to get these MS4 permits reinstated. This was back in 2017, and we're watching the new administration closely and are prepared to hold them accountable to current laws, just as we did the last time. Additionally, the incoming administration has indicated a preference for a broader state and local authority, and we at IRWA have a long history of engaging with regulators and policymakers in Boston and in the cities and towns that make up our watershed to ensure that their plans, policies, and regulations are protective of the health of the river going forward. Even if the federal government is going to take its foot off the gas in terms of environmental protection, restoration, and climate resilience, we know that there is plenty of work that we can do in our own backyard to improve the on-the-ground conditions for our river. So a few things that we have been working on at the state and local levels recently, and a few wins in our column already this year. So earlier this year, the Massachusetts state legislature passed the climate bill, and it's heading to the governor's desk for signing. Our river depends on us to mitigate climate change, and Massachusetts can really take pride in leading this effort. The bill also includes an amendment championed by our very own Rep. Kastner and Senator Tarr from this region, which streamlines the permitting process for restoration work in wetlands. That is great news for the health of the Great Marsh, and it's also great news for all of us in this community doing this type of restoration work. Also in this past legislative session, we advocated for the drought bill, which was not passed, but it did make it farther than it ever has, and it was passed by the Senate. You can bet that we will be advocating for this bill's eventual passage in the next legislative session starting next year. And you can keep an eye on our advocacy alerts in your email inbox when it comes time for you to write to your elected officials to advocate for critical legislation. Another local effort that we're very engaged in is the North Shore Water Resilience Task Force, which was chartered back in 2022 and is truly a unique effort to facilitate regional decision-making to address water supply resiliency and improve ecosystem health regionally and collaboratively. IRWA, along with all of the cities, towns, and water utilities that rely on the Ipswich River, are signatories to this task force and are working towards finding a solution to our common challenges. One that will likely be more effective if undertaken together than for each town to go at it alone. To date, the task force has commissioned the completion of 3 technical studies and has moved on to the decision-making phase of their work, meaning that we are pursuing solutions to water scarcity here on the North Shore. At the local level, with our cities and towns, we are advocating for what we affectionately refer to as a recipe for resiliency, which outlines specific changes that we can make to our town and city bylaws, ordinances, and regulations to conserve water, reduce demand on the river, and protect our river from pollution. And we look forward to continuing to educate residents about why these revisions are so important and work with our local town staffs to implement them. We at IRWA have also been advancing on-the-ground projects aimed at improving climate resilience, projects that will prepare our communities for the impacts of increasing flooding, severe droughts, and other hazards. So, for example, did you all know that an upgraded culvert not only allows for improved fish passage, but it can also reduce the risk of flooding upstream of the culvert and reduce the risk that the road above the culvert is overtopped, which can lead to the closure of critical evacuation routes during storms. So, it's true. An upgraded culvert can do all of those things. And we have a number of those projects in the pipeline. One of them up in Newbury is getting worked on as we speak. And that is sometimes what improved climate resilience looks like. It's one improved culvert at a time. So the last thing that I'm going to touch on in this State of the River talk is what funding looks like for us over the next 4 years. And I'm only going to talk briefly about it because I've been asked a few times. The last 4 years have brought unprecedented levels of federal funding to our work, largely through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And as an organization, IRWA has been very successful in accessing this federal funding. And it has played a part in our overall funding model and critically provided funding for those type of larger scale infrastructure projects that we've been involved in. The past 4 years for IRWA have been about accelerating the pace of our work, and that's in part been driven by a few substantial grants that we won stemming from monies from these two spending bills. And it's also in part a materialization of the decades of work put in by volunteers and staff at IRWA to get us to this point. As far as IRWA's funding going forward is concerned, we knew that the federal support from the past 4 years could prove to be an anomaly. There was never a guarantee that it would continue. And fortunately, our organization has diverse funding streams. We rely on our individual members, state funds, private donors, and private foundations to keep our work going. For example, a couple of years ago, we received $1 million from a private foundation to support infrastructure and restoration projects. And so all of that work will continue independent of any reduction in funding from the federal government. Our team has already started thinking about what additional funding sources we can tap into, given the likelihood that federal funding for our work will decline. So for example, in Massachusetts, we've already been an active part of the MVP Coalition, which is a group of organizations that has been pushing for expansion of Massachusetts' Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which is the primary funding mechanism for cities and towns in Massachusetts to invest in climate resiliency with state funds. We're advocating for that program to grow from 20 million to 100 million annually, in a real reflection of the need for investment in climate resiliency across the Commonwealth. So while we would love to see continued investment at the federal level in resiliency and restoration work, we have never been dependent on that funding for our continued operations. So finally, for many environmentalists, there is a sense that protecting the environment is not going to be a priority for this next administration. And for those of us that feel that climate change is truly a crisis, there is an element of fear that we're going to backslide on the progress that we've made or not address these problems fast enough. But the federal government is not the only mechanism for how this work gets done. In fact, in many ways, the actions that we take on the ground and in our communities are far more impactful than the machinations of the federal government. I'm going to circle all the way back for a moment to our current drought. To address this drought today, it is extremely important that we are aggressively reducing our non-essential water use. And the way that we do that is through a community of individuals making choices daily in their own homes that can have a massive impact on the health of our ecosystem and on our communities. We can all shorten our showers, fix our leaks, and refrain from outdoor water use. And those actions will have far more impact on the conditions that we're experiencing right now than anything that could be mandated from Washington. One of my staff members offered this reflection on water. Water in its time can carve valleys out of hills. Water flowing forever with the certainty of gravity changes the very shape of our earth. Our task is simply to keep it flowing here in our corner of the world. And with that, please consider this my call, or perhaps my reminder to all of you to take action in your community. Save water, be vigilant against fire risk, and make sure your state and local leaders are paying attention to these issues now and in the future. By protecting our river, we are protecting every neighbor's cup of coffee, every neighbor's shower after a long day, every neighbor's indoor plumbing, every neighbor's dip in the cool, clear running river during those increasingly common 100-degree days, and every neighbor's opportunity to witness the wonderful biodiversity around them. We are protecting the organisms that depend on the river and that we in turn depend on for joy, for sustenance, and for a healthy, balanced environment. So that concludes my remarks. I want to thank you all for being here. And I also want to hold space for your thoughts and your questions. So I think we're going to answer some of the questions that have been coming in on the chat. And feel free to add more there or raise your hand if you would like to ask your question out loud. And Emma can help me unmute people.
Yeah, let's start with there's a question in the chat from Ruth, just to get started. Ruth asks, how are towns drawing water from the river upstream from Ipswich? For example, Middleton, Topsfield, Beverly, Salem. And is that being controlled to keep the river flowing? So I think a question about drought conditions right now.
Yeah, so because the entire region is in a state declared drought, all of those towns are being encouraged to reduce their water demand. There is a kind of patchwork of regulations that dictate how each community can withdraw water during drought conditions. Some of them have stricter requirements than others. But given the severe nature of this drought and the fact that it's widespread, all of our communities are under at least a recommendation from the state to reduce their water use. And hopefully that answers Ruth's question. One of the things that we are working on too, I mentioned this is a patchwork of requirements. We're really pushing the state to start standardizing the requirements during drought. That's part of what the drought bill that I mentioned that's making its way through the legislature would do. And that would also be very rooted in the realities of what is happening in a drought on the ground, rather than what the requirements of the various permits have been, largely which have been dictated at which point in time they were filed. So to really root our response to drought in the conditions on the ground and in the science around drought management.
Thanks, Ruth, for that question. Kristen Grubbs shared, first she just said, so grateful for IRWA's work on Newbury's Cart Creek Culvert Project. Thank you, Kristen. She also asked, what might be some steps to take to consider expanding the North Shore Resilience Task Force to include the Parker River watershed communities, or Parker, Ipswich, and Essex rivers altogether in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, I would say that part of the reason that we are a watershed association is that a watershed is really a useful unit in the environment to think about, because it is all connected naturally and it extends across political borders. And when we have been in the past talking about how we're going to manage our water resources, we've really looked at it community by community. So the effort of the task force is to start taking a watershed-based approach and thinking about all of these hydrologically connected resources. The Ipswich River is one of the most intensively used in the state, and so it is kind of the poster child for these conditions. However, and I know Kristen is very aware of this, the Parker River is right up there with the Ipswich in terms of how much it's being used and the stresses that are put on it from water supply. In terms of expanding the North Shore Resiliency Task Force to include Parker River watershed communities, I think there's an opportunity to export the kind of structure of that task force and take maybe some lessons learned from how that work has moved forward, and to start coalescing other groups in the state where we can connect people who are drawing on the same water source to be thinking regionally about it. And hopefully the Parker River is the next one that is able to take advantage of that collaborative consensus building model that we're trying to push forward at the North Shore Resiliency Task Force. I think those are the only questions that I've seen come in on the chat. Does anyone have any other further questions or thoughts they'd like to share?
Erin, we're not getting anything from the chat just right now. Seems like those were the big questions. I have had, oh, I see Deb Logan has just put something in the chat. I was just asked by our engagement manager, Carla, to plug our action event this Friday. So on Friday, we will be gathering in the parking lot behind Zoomies in Ipswich, if you're close by, starting at 9 o'clock. IRWA staff are going to be out there picking up trash, doing a river cleanup, and you are very much welcome to join. I think it's going to be a really wonderful community event just to see some other faces and go out and do something for the river. Now, it does look like we've got a few comments in the chat, so let's see. Deborah says, individual household water conservation is very important in the face of drought. Agreed. How does this compare in volume/impact to leaking municipal water pipes and delivery systems? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's one of the metrics that all water utilities look at, is how much water in the industry, it's called unaccounted for water, and that encompasses a bunch of things, but it includes water that is leaking out through your distribution system. And it really varies by community in our region, how much water is leaking out of their pipes. The industry standard is to aim for around 10% of unaccounted for water. And some of our communities hit that, and some of them are kind of not close. And what that points to is, well, one, I would say more information, right? Because unaccounted for water can be leaking water. It can be a problem with your accounting system. It can be you're using a lot of water for things like firefighting, which is not metered. And so that would be counting towards unaccounted for water. So you want to pinpoint where all your water is going and make sure you have a really thorough understanding of that. And then if it is leaking out of your distribution system, find the money to invest in your pipe system to reduce those leaks. That is a longer term solution. Very hard to, in drought conditions, fix leaks in the next couple of weeks if you don't already have those plans in place. And that is one of those longer term solutions that we're looking at through the task force. And the IRWA is positioned to help our towns hopefully find some funding or some project management capacity to do things like fix leaking pipes, which is a great low-hanging water conservation strategy.
Speaking of water conservation strategies, we have a few questions coming in about water conservation. So Ruth has two questions that I'll sort of put together. The first one is about which is the most important action to help with water usage as individuals. Like, what is the most impactful thing we can do? And then her second question is about the town of Ipswich. Are they offering any incentives for water conservation?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so prioritizing water usage. So normally I would say it's outdoor water use, because when we look at our summertime water use, there's about up to 50%, but depending on the community, is going to outdoor water use. But because this drought is so unseasonal, that's probably not the case for this drought. And so then it starts to be looking at how is your household using water. I can plug, Emma came up with a great interactive game that we've been putting out on social media to think about how much each of your water using appliances or behaviors, how much water they're using in your home. So for example, are you running the tap when you're not using water? Are you hand washing your dishes? Because dishwashers are actually much more water efficient than hand washing. That's one of the ones that I love because I hate washing dishes. So using your dishwasher, filling your dishwasher before you run it, taking shorter showers. Leaks in your house can also use a lot of water, and leaks typically, they're going to look like, is your toilet running? Is your faucet leaking into the sink? So it might be things that you have been thinking are not really a problem and have been putting off on fixing. But if you're really looking to conserve water, you should be thinking about all of that water that is not being used and is still being wasted down your drains. What was the second part of that question?
Oh,
incentivizing water conservation?
Yes, is the town of Ipswich offering any incentives for water conservation? Which I don't think that they are, but maybe you can speak to that.
I don't think that they are either. There's an incentive inherent in your water bill that if you're conserving water, you will be saving money on your water bill. And there are longer term programs like getting rain barrels installed. For example, I know a lot of communities in the watershed will offer rebates on rain barrels, or possibly rebates on water efficient appliances, if you're looking at that for your home. So those are some of those longer term kind of systemic water conservation practices that we do incentivize.
Awesome. Okay, I'm just going to point out Carla, our engagement manager, has dropped a couple of links in the chat. The first link that she dropped in there is to our event, the cleanup event this Friday. The second link she dropped in there is it takes you to our Instagram reel talking about Guess the Gallons, which is the game Erin was referencing. Now we have a few more questions. Actually, they've been rolling in, so let's see if we can get to these. I'm going to ask, which one am I going to do next? Hey, Carol, as far as what programs are coming out in the future to watch out for, just keep an eye on our events page. It'll be updated pretty soon. I think that we have some more action parties coming down the pipeline, but the Ipswich River events page is the best place to look for that. Now, the next question is about Wenham Lake water levels. Jean says Wenham Lake's water levels seem to be much higher. Is this water coming from the Ipswich River?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually on my to-do list to write a blog post answering this very question. So you guys will get a preview to that. So Wenham Lake is one of the reservoirs managed by the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board. It's a natural lake, but it's currently managed as a reservoir. And what that means is that the water levels, when they go up and down in the lake, it's because of activities by the water supply board. It's fairly independent of drought conditions. And what that means is, so currently and seasonally, Wenham Lake will drop to its lowest levels in August or September as the cities draw on that lake to use water during the summer. And then at this time of year, they refill that lake from water stored in Putnamville Reservoir. So that water is currently coming out of the Putnamville Reservoir, not directly out of the river. And then in the wintertime, the Putnamville Reservoir will get refilled directly from the river, based on restricted to the time of year that they can withdraw that water, and also they can only withdraw that water when the river is at flood stage. So they're taking water when the water levels are high. That window for refilling out of the river starts in December, I believe, but it is also tied to the flow of the river. And so if we are not out of drought conditions, then that will be impacted, the time of year that they're going to be able to withdraw from the river to refill those reservoirs.
Okay, I've got another plug, this one from Abby. Reminder that the PI, which is Parker, Ipswich, and Essex Rivers annual meeting, is Thursday, December 5th at the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge building on Plum Island. We had a great discussion last year. We talked about all three watersheds. Thank you, Abby, for that plug. We have a question from Kent, who asks, what are some of the challenges in getting communities that draw upon the Ipswich River to agree on regulation? It's a very big question.
That is a very big question. So in Massachusetts, the regulations, we have a long history of water regulations. So the Salem Beverly question, for example, I think Salem got rights to take water out of Wenham Lake in the 1860s. So the Civil War was happening when that water supply decision was made. And that's just one example of, we are living with a long history of how are we going to manage this natural resource, and it's been very patched together over time. And so getting everyone to think about this collectively is really a new construct in the water management space. Typically, every town kind of goes it alone. They think about how they are going to supply their citizens, and they think their thinking kind of ends at the town borders. And that's not a criticism of the people that are doing the very difficult work of providing safe drinking water. It's just the way that we collectively have decided that we're going to manage this resource. I personally feel like with the impacts of climate change, that way of thinking about things is going to be less and less effective going forward. And we're going to have to think much more dynamically about how we are managing this resource collectively. And that's really what the task force is trying to do, and trying to get people to rethink how we are making these decisions, and how we are implementing these solutions. And it's just hard because there's a lot of inertia in the ways that we have been doing things. The infrastructure is set up for each town to be managing it independently. And so there are physical challenges to thinking about it collectively, and there are governance challenges to thinking of it collectively as well.
Okay, I think we have one last question, Erin, and I do think that we need to leave it there. If you have any other thoughts that you want to drop into the chat, please feel free to drop them in here. This is for all of you. Chris asks, can new incoming federal agency administrators take away grant funding that has already been awarded?
That is a great question, and one that we have been actively pondering here at IRWA. So when you get awarded a grant from the federal government, they're all structured a little differently. So I'm going to speak in generalities here, but you essentially sign a contract with the federal government that for a scope of work and a budget. And a lot of them are reimbursement, so we don't get funding. Funding doesn't sit in our bank accounts. We draw it down as that work gets done. Historically, the federal government has not taken away grant funding that has already been awarded and contracted out, even though our contracts go out a year or two in the future. We're kind of operating on that history, but also knowing that the new administration is kind of talking about redoing the playbook. And so it's kind of an open question of whether they're going to abide by that historical precedent.
All right, I think that we need to wrap it up, but Dave Lash did ask if we have other large watershed associations that we admire. And my answer to that is that we really admire them all. We just appreciate the work that they're doing. Erin, anything to say on top of that?
No, I think that comes as, what I love about watershed associations is that they are, by their very definition, like locally rooted in their communities, and they're doing work on the ground, and they can look really different depending on what their community looks like and what their climate looks like. So if we think about watershed associations that are dealing with the Colorado River, they're just going to have such a different perspective on this work. So it's just incredible the way that everyone is really taking into account their own community's needs and challenges to get this work done. Thank you all so much for coming today. This has been really fun. I think it's our first, I don't know if it's IRWA's first, but it's our Emma, Carla, and I's first live stream webinar. And so we really enjoyed putting this together. We're so glad that you all came, and we hope you got something out of it. And if there's any other questions that come up, feel free to reach out to any of us. We're always happy to answer questions and have conversations.
Thank you all.
Thanks.